All right, it's time to put everything together. And we're going to start with a brand new application. And we're going to build an application with users and messages. So we're going to include migrations, we're going to have associations. We're then going to later on add things like forms and some tests and deploy it a bit later. But for now, we're just going to start with a skeleton. We're going to start with one resource at a time and build CRUD on everything. So just like before, I'm going to make a directory. And I'm going to call that users messages. Inside of here, I'm going to cd. And I'm also going to create a database called users messages. I'm going to use that database to store all this information related to users and messages. Before we even worry about the association and setting up that information, let's just build full CRUD on our users. So what we're going to do, once again, is make a directory called templates. Inside of templates, we're going to make a file called base.html. But inside of here, we're actually going to make two folders, one for users and one for messages. And inside of users, we're going to make index new edit and show.html. And inside of messages, we're going to do the same exact thing. We're also going to need some essential files like an app and a manage.py. Remember, manage.py is for our migrations. App.py is where all of our routes are going to be placed, as well as all of our models. You're going to really see here how it gets a bit messy once you have more than one resource. And later on, we're going to introduce a concept called blueprints to really refactor this code. But for now, we're going to put it all in one file. Let's just get these fundamentals down. If I take a quick look at my folder structure, this should be OK. I have my app, my manage, templates has base. Then I have messages and users with all the necessary HTML files. All right. What I want to do now is make a virtual environment. mk virtual env, and we can call this users messages app. So we'll give that a second, make sure that pip is installed. Remember, in our virtual environment, we don't have to use Python 3 or pip 3. It'll make life much easier for us for managing this specific set of dependencies or modules that our application depends on. Well, what do we need? We need Flask. We need IPython for debugging. We want Flask script. We want Flask migrate. We also want psychopg2. We want Flask modus to override the method. And we're going to want flask-sqlalchemy. I might be missing one now, but worst comes to worst, we can always clean it up later if we need. So we're going to give that a second to install all those dependencies. It's going to be really important that we install these, otherwise most of our application is just not going to work. So make sure you get as many of these dependencies as you can, and if you miss one, you can always install it later. Great. Here comes the fun part. Where do we start? Well, we can start by doing our routes. We can start by setting up the manage.py file. I'd recommend just start with the manage.py file because it's very, very procedural. You could even make a snippet to do most of that. From the app, we're going to import app and db. We're also going to, from Flask script, import manager. This is the class that we're going to use to start creating command line scripts. And from Flask migrate, we're going to import the migrate class as well as the migrate command class. And what are we going to do first? Make a variable migrate and instantiate the migrate class with our app and with a DB. Now, you may be wondering, wait, I don't have app and DB yet. That's OK. We'll make those before we run any migrations. We're also going to make a manager variable and assign that to the manager class with our app. We're then going to add a command called db. You could call this whatever you like, but we're going to call it db. And then we're going to specify that all those commands are from the migrate command class. That's going to give us db init and upgrade and migrate and all those ones that we're going to use. Finally, if name is main, we're then going to manager.run. And that's really it for the manage.py file. Like we said, this is very procedural. You want to make sure you do this step by step and you get this correct, but it's going to be almost the same for all the files that you're working in. All right, let's go to our app.py. Well, what do we need? First off, from Flask, we're going to need a bunch of things. We're going to need Flask. I may not be using these right away, but let's try to import what we need right off the bat. We're going to need request to get data from a form. We're going to need redirect. We're going to need render template. We're going to need URL4. And maybe I'm missing one. Who knows? We'll see. What else do I need inside of this application? Well, we're going to need some pretty important things from SQLAlchemy. So from flask-sqlalchemy, we're going to import the SQL Alchemy class. This is really important to make sure that we connect to the right database and set up any configuration code necessary. We also need to grab modus so that we can override the method and use things like patch and delete. And my linter is going crazy because I'm not using any of these yet, but I promise you I will. Let's make a variable app. That's a result of Flask. We've seen this before. We can even start with a if name is main. Let's run that application, debug true, and we'll keep it on port 3000. That's just easier for me. You can keep that whatever you'd like. We're also going to configure something very important. This is going to be our SQL Alchemy database URI. Come on, there we go. And that's going to be Postgres, localhost, and then the name of our database, which, if I remember correctly, that was, wait for it, users messages. Great, users messages. I always forget that. What do we need to do next? Make sure we set up modus. And a lot of this is really the same kind of configuration that you've seen before, DB as well, SQL Alchemy. We're gonna grab our application. Now, if you'd like, there is a warning that you'll see each time called track modifications. And if you'd like, we can absolutely turn that off. So don't worry too much about what that does. It actually has an issue with performance and changing things. But right now we're going to keep it really simple and configure SQL Alchemy track modifications. And we'll set that to be false. It should take out some of those nice warnings that we get every time that we start the server. Now it's time to make our models. We could add users and messages right off the bat, but let's imagine that we just want to do users first. We're just going to build CRUD on users, and then we'll introduce messages after. So our models are always in the singular, and our models always inherit from db.model. So what are we going to put inside of here? First thing we always need is a table name. Always want to make sure our table name is in the plural. We then have to make sure that we have some columns. So we're going to add a db.column, and that's going to be an integer. And we need a primary key. Remember, IDs have to be unique, so we want to enforce uniqueness using a primary key. What else do we want here for a user? Why don't we give them a first name, and that will be a db.text, and we'll give them a last name as well. Right now, these are going to be the columns. What we need to think about next is when we create a user, what's it going to look like? We're going to use that same special method under init. I'll add a couple more spaces right here. And inside of here, we're always going to add self as an instance method, first name and last name. And we've seen this one before, self.firstname. It's going to be the first name, Command-Shift-D to duplicate that line, and Command-D to highlight the next occurrence, and that will be our last name, if I can spell that correctly. So this is what our user should look like. What we need to then think about is, what's the table going to look like? Well, in order for the table to work correctly, we need to do something like generate some migrations. So Python manage py. First thing we need is to make sure we initialize correctly. Let's make sure that we set up that initial folder. Here's our migrations. There are versions. We don't have any. That's okay. What I'm going to run is Python manage py db migrate -m adding users table. What does this do for me? Well, instead of giving it some really complex name that I can't find, I'm going to name this migration. So inside of versions, it's now called adding users table as well as that ID. This is really valuable to make sure that when you look at all your migrations, you can actually see what they do without having to click in and guess and check. So that -m flag and quotes is really helpful to name your migrations. Inside of here, what are we doing? We're going to create a table users. We're going to add a column ID, first name, last name, and then drop the table if we downgrade. That looks good. We've migrated. What's the next step? Python manage py db upgrade. Let's make sure we upgrade successfully. How do we know if we did this right? Well, let's hop into PSQL users messages. Let's take a look at our tables. Let's take a look at the users table. And it looks like we have an ID, a first name, and a last name. That looks great. Before you worry about any of your routes, just make sure that your logic is set up correctly. Now we're going to do a lot of the same kind of CRUD that we've done before. We're going to set up our first route. And here we'll keep it simple. When you go to the root route, we'll run a function called root. And here we're just going to return redirect URL for index. Okay, well, we need an index then. app.route/users. We want to make sure that here we have a get and a post. This is all stuff that you might have seen before. This just takes a bit of practice and some repetition. This will be index. Inside of here, we want to make sure that we do a little bit of checking. If request.method is post, let's make sure we call that method. If it is a post, then we want to create a new user. Otherwise, we're going to return render template users/index.html. Remember, we can't just render index.html because if it's all coming from the templates folder, we need to make sure we're inside of the users folder. It's a bit of a gotcha. It's also going to come into play when we start rendering our base.html. So if request.method is post, what do we want to do here? Well, let's make a new user. It's going to be the result of the user class with request.form, first name, and we'll also grab request.form of last name. Let's make sure we spell that correctly. We then want to db.session.add new user and db.session.commit. Finally, we'll return a redirect URL for index. Now, we haven't really set up this form or anything yet, but I just want to start with creating users and reading users. If I want to get all of the users, I'm going to have to query user.query.all. This is the same as running select star from users. Just go to the database and grab me all of the users. We've set up a little bit of code in Python. I'm moving quickly, but these are things that you should have seen before that should become a bit procedural. Let's take a look at users. And even before that, let's take a look at base.html. Let's set up some boilerplate with a simple block content, and then we'll end block. That's all we're going to do in our base.html. Inside of our index.html, if we do something like extends base.html, well, we might have a bit of a problem because base.html is not in the root of this directory. Well, why don't we see what happens? Let's add a block content. We'll make sure we end block. And here we'll say something like, see all the users. We'll save that, head over to the terminal. Let's start the server, python app.py. Jump over to the browser. Let's go to localhost 3000, and we can see all the users. Well, it appears that our base.html is actually working. Well, you might have thought that would be an issue. Well, no worries. It's pretty smart here. Everything is going to come from the templates folder. So if we want to get some information from our templates, no problem. Everything starts with base.html. So the good news is that actually does work. You might have thought maybe I need to extends and go back a folder and save this right here. Well, this would actually get upset. It would tell us that template's not found because everything starts from the templates folder. So if we just simply put in base.html, we're in great shape. So no worries here. You might have thought that would trip us up. Might have led you astray a little bit there, but make sure you understand base.html lives in the templates folder in the root of that directory. And when templates are found, they're going to start with that base.html. So you're okay for now. What do we then need to do? Well, let's loop over for user in users. Let's make sure we end that for. And what should we do here? Let's go print out each user's first name, user.firstname, and space, and then user.lastname. We also want to make sure that we have an anchor tag that goes to URL for new. And what do we want to do here? We'll say add a new user. So let's go back here, take a look, and could not build URL for endpoint new. Well, we've seen this one before. Well, what's the problem? We don't have a URL. Well, we got to make sure we make a route for /users/new. It's a function called new, and here we're going to return render template, and the template here once again is new.html, but it lives in the users folder. So always make sure this is the users new right here. You can refresh the page. I'll add a new user, and there we are. We're moving quickly here, but just to recap, we've made a folder called users with new and index. We've set up the logic for creating, but we haven't actually built the form to do that yet. So let's do that. Back in new.html, same thing as before. Extends base.html. Make sure we have a block content. Command-Shift-D to duplicate that line. I'll end block, start with an H1, and here we'll say add a new user. Now, we don't really have anything like permissions set up and usernames and passwords, so don't worry too much about that for now. We're keeping things really simple. We're going to make a form that has a method of post, and where's it going to go? It can go to /users, and that's okay, but let's really try to use URL for so that we don't have to hard code these routes. URL for index. And inside of this form, we're going to need a couple inputs. We're going to need an input for the first name, and we're going to need an input for the last name. I'm going to keep this a little simple for now. I'll take out these IDs, and I'll say right here, add a user. If you'd like, you can totally make a button. That's absolutely fine. It says add a user. This is totally valid as well. Either one, totally fine. Just make sure you have the name attribute in the form. It's going to be super important. Now, back over here, if I add a new user, Ellie Shopik, we have me right there. Great. How did that happen? Well, back in our app.py, we grabbed information from the form, first name and last name. Where does that come from? If you don't remember, that comes from the name attribute. Always make sure those match up. We then added that and committed it. This is part of flask-sqlalchemy to make sure that we write to the database, and then we redirected to index. All right, we have creating and we have reading. Next up, let's do some editing and deleting. I'm not going to worry too much about the show page for now. Let's keep things really simple. I just want the ability to edit and delete pretty quickly. So inside of this page, I'm going to make a new line, and then I'm going to make a link to edit a specific user. URL for edit. And remember, this is going to need some kind of ID. So what's that going to be? User.id. And here we'll say edit a user. I'm also going to make a form to delete. Now remember, with our forms for deleting, we're going to need to override the method. So how does that work? It's going to be, once again, a URL for show with ID of user ID and a method underscore method of delete. And here we're just going to have an input with a type of submit and a value of X. Now this is actually going to break a lot of things because we don't have any of those URLs right now. Could not build URL endpoint edit with values ID. Okay, well, back in our app.py, let's go make a route for /users /int ID /edit. We're going to call that edit, and it accepts an ID. Always make sure you have that keyword argument. And here we're going to return render template /users, /edit.html. And then we're going to get some kind of user, which is the result of user.query.get that ID. If you'd like, you can make a variable called found_user and do user.query.get ID. That's totally fine. If you feel like this is not as readable, either one of those will work just fine. All we've done here is just gotten a user by an ID. Let's go back here, and we're making some progress. Now it could not build URL for endpoint show with values ID. So what do we need to do? Well, something very similar. But instead of users /int ID /edit, we're just going to do users /int ID. We're also going to call this show. You can't have two names of view functions that are the same. You'll actually see here that my linter is not too happy. Redefinition of unused edit. This actually will throw an error, so be careful here. I'm going to call this show. And inside of show, I actually need quite a few methods. Remember, we're going to need get, we're going to need patch for eventual editing, and we're going to need delete to remove things. So once again, if request.method is, once again, a byte string, we got to watch out for that. If it is patch, and let's make sure that we get some quotes around here. Well, I might not know what to do yet, so let's just say edit this user. How about if the method is delete? Then we will delete this user. Otherwise, we can just return show, for example. And that found user that I had above, I'll do the same thing. Found user is user.query.get for some ID. So if the method is patch, we want to edit the user. If the method is delete, we want to delete the user. And when we're done with these, we can return redirect URL4 back to index. We can do that for both of these. Now, there are ways to refactor this code, but I want to be really explicit with what we're doing step by step. So if the method is patch, what do we need to do? Found user.firstName is going to be request.form of first name. Whatever you get from the form, set that to be the first name. Same thing with the last name. And just like before, db.session.add found user and db.session.commit. How about over here? How do we delete the user? Well, db.session.delete found user, db.session.commit. And when we're done, we're going to redirect back to index and redirect back to index. Let's also make sure that this is a mistake. That should be users/show.html. That's what happens when you move quickly. But let's go see what this does for us. Let's go back to /users, make sure that my server is starting. And let's start this up again and go to /users. And here is Ellie Shopik. Let's get rid of him. Okay, localhost 3000 /users/1 ? Why is that the case? Well, if I take a look back, it's actually making a GET request to /users/1. Let's take a look at this code, and I'll give you a second to see what's going on here. But in my index.html, I made a pretty critical mistake. The error is going on line 11, and it's because I'm missing an important attribute on these forms. Whenever we override the method, we always have to make sure that we're overriding a post. So if you ever see this right here happening, something's getting added to the query string and you don't see what you expect, make sure you get that attribute as well. So back to users, let's try this again. And there we go. Now we're deleting successfully. If I add a new user, let's add Ellie again. If I edit this user, I'm not getting much. That's because I don't actually have an edit.html. So what I'm going to do, and there are better ways to refactor this, but we're going to be really explicit here. I'm going to borrow most of the code from my new.html, and I'm going to do that inside of my edit.html. But instead of URL for index, where do I want to go? URL for show. But that's going to require some kind of ID. So let's make sure that we're doing this correctly. Back in our app.py, we're rendering a template called usersEdit, and we're passing in a variable called user. So inside of edit, we want to make sure that the ID is user.id. And when we do this, we always have to make sure we're overriding a method of patch. What else can we do inside of this edit form? Well, maybe instead of saying add, we can say edit a user. And we can add another attribute called value, which is going to be whatever information exists about that user. So we'll say first name, and here I'll fix this to be last name. Let's go back and take a look at users to edit, and there we go, Ellie again. Does our editing work? It appears to. Now we're moving through this CRUD on users quickly because this is something that you should be familiar with at this point. We haven't gotten to a second resource, we haven't gotten to associations yet, but right now let's just make sure we have some CRUD on a single resource using migrations that we have with our manage.py. So taking a quick look at what we built so far, this is our app.py. We have a class for a user, a table name of users. We route to the root route, which redirects us to index. Our users route has get and post methods enabled. You could make these two separate routes, /users with a method of get, /users with a method of post. I like to combine them because it's less code. And here, if the method is post, we're going to create. Otherwise, we're just going to render index. And the rest of this should look pretty similar to what we've seen before with flask-sqlalchemy and migrations. All right, now for the fun part. We need to start adding a second resource or a second noun that we're going to operate on called messages. So what we're first going to do is make a class for a message. And here we're going to inherit from db.model. We're going to make sure that we have a table name also of messages. And I'll bring this back, scroll down a little bit. And what columns do we want for a message? Let's keep this really simple. We want an ID, a db.column. That's going to be a db.integer. And just like we had before, primary key of true. Try to use tab completion as much as you can, especially once you've done something already, to make sure you don't have any spelling mistakes. Now inside of this message column, we're also going to have a name. Better yet, let's say every message has some kind of content. And that's going to be a db.text. But first, a db.column. If you notice here, db.column is a class. And here we're instantiating db.column with db.text. That looks good. What else do we need inside of our message? Well, this is important. Remember that every message has to be associated with some kind of user. So we are going to add a column called user_ID, and that is going to be, once again, a column. What data type is it? Well, it's an integer as well, but it is also a foreign key. And a foreign key refers to the name of some table and then the column that is associated with. So what's the name of our table? Users. And what is the column? ID. This looks great so far. We could run the migration now, and it will look exactly the same as what we're about to do. What we're about to do next is not actually going to create anything on the migration level. This is important for setting up an association between users and messages. So inside of user, we're actually going to add a property called messages. And this right here is a db.relationship. This is not going to affect anything on the database level. This is simply a way for flask-sqlalchemy to associate one model with another. What is the model that we're associating with user? The model is actually message. We're going to pass in a couple of keyword arguments right here. The first is a backref, and that is going to be user. And the second is going to be lazy. We're going to pass in dynamic. What this basically allows us to do is if we were to find a specific user, we could access all of the messages by doing user.messages. And if we were to find a specific message, we could access it by message.user. Notice here this is in the singular, that is the backref. And here this is in the plural because one user has many messages. This is a one-to-many association right now. One user can write many messages. Each message belongs to a specific user. So we're going to save that now. And what are we going to do? Let's go run this migration again. Python manage py db migrate. Remember, let's give this a name. Here we'll say adding messages table. Let's go run that. Let's take a look at what happens. In our migrations folder, we should now have a versions called adding messages. And what are we doing right here? Adding a table, messages, adding a column ID, content and user ID, adding a foreign key, user ID, which relates to the users table and the ID column, and a primary key ID on the table for messages. Notice here that db.relationship isn't happening anywhere. That's something we set up for SQLAlchemy, not for our migrations. So let's go back and let's make sure that back in Python manage.py, we actually upgrade this information right here. Great, here we're adding a messages table. If we take a quick look at PSQL, users messages, we should see we now have two tables. We can take a look at everything in users. We can take a look at everything in messages. And that looks good. ID, content, and user ID. Excellent. If we \d plus messages, we can actually see that there is a foreign key constraint here, which references users ID. All of this SQL is being written for us by our migration with Python and Flask migrate. Great. Now the rest of this code that we need to write is going to be inside of here once again. We need to set up all of our routes for messages. This is going to be a little bit trickier because all of our messages are going to be nested inside of users. So every single route that we make is going to start with /users / some kind of user ID / messages. Everything is going to start with this because we're going to need the user ID for a specific message. There is a way to refactor this using a concept called shallow routing, but we're going to be very explicit once again here and write things out and be very verbose. So what do we need to do? We need to be able to see all the messages for a specific user. What do we then want to do? We want to create a message for a specific user. We want to edit a message for a specific user, and we want to delete a message for a specific user. Now the show page here with messages is a little bit strange. You can add it if you want. I'm just going to add the CRUD functionality, and whatever templates we work in, we'll kind of keep it simple there. So what is the route to see all the messages for a specific user? Well, the route is /users / some kind of int user ID / messages. Now notice we're not doing ID right here. This is part of the RESTful routing convention because later on we're going to need an ID for the message. So we're going to keep calling this user ID. Now here, we can't really call this index because we already have an index. So we're going to call this messages index. And let's not do much here. Let's just set up our routes. If we want to create a message for a specific user, no problem. That's just a method with get and post. that should handle these two right here. See all the messages and create. How about editing a message for a specific user? Well, that route is going to look like /user/int_id/user/messages/ some kind of ID /edit. As you can see, once you have lots of resources, you don't want to nest them all inside of each other. You get some really long routes. But let's call this messages edit. How about deleting a message? Well, it's going to look very similar, except we're not going to have edit at the end. And here inside of our edit, we're not going to have a methods of get and post. That's just going to be a get by default. But inside of here, we're going to have methods for get, for patch, and for delete. You might be wondering, hey, what about new? We're missing that. You're right. Let's go add this in here. Messages/new. And this is going to be messages new, and this is going to be messages show. Another thing we need to think about is each of these accept keyword arguments. Messages new accepts a user ID. Messages edit accepts a user ID and an ID. So be very careful with these keyword arguments. I'd say when you're setting this up, actually set up your routes first. It'll really help you reason about what's going on here. For messages index, what we need to do here is find a user, and that's it. You might be wondering, what about the messages? Well, we're going to let Jinja handle that logic. So what we're going to do is we're going to return render template. And what are we going to do? The template's going to be called messages/index, but we're actually going to pass in a user, user.query.get by user ID. Remember, user ID is the keyword argument here. So let's go take a look at what that index file might look like. Let's go to index.html for messages. Once again, we're going to extends base.html. We're going to open up a block content, and we're going to end that block. And what we'll do here is see all the messages for user dot, let's just say first name. We'll keep it simple. Now, how do we display all of the messages for a specific user? Well, if you remember, inside of our class, we have a property on each user called messages, which means that we should be able to do something like for message in user.messages. Let's end that for, and here we'll print out message.content. Let's see what happens if we go to that specific route. And we might be wondering also, how do we get there? So inside of our index.html for users, let's add another link. This is going to be a URL for messages index. And what's the keyword argument that messages index accepts? What was that again? Let's go down, user ID. So we have to make sure that user_ID is user ID. And here, see all messages for user.firstname. A lot of moving parts here. So if you'd like, pause the video, take a look at the code we have so far back in our app.py. All we're doing is rendering messages index, be very specific, .html. We're going to get that user. Now we're writing a bunch of code here, so let's take a break, go to the browser, see what's actually happening. Let's go back to localhost 3000, make sure the server started, Python, app.py. Let's go back over here to /users, and here we see all the messages for Ellie. When I click on this, there's nothing there. How come there are no messages for Ellie? Well, because Ellie has not written any messages. So how can we change that? Well, let's go back to our app.py, and let's go make a new message for Ellie. So inside of this page, I'd like to add a link to create a new message for this specific user. This is where URL for is really helpful. I want to make a URL for, what's the name of my view function? Let's see, that was messages new. Remember, it accepts a keyword argument user ID. Messages new, user ID is going to be user.id. Remember, I'm rendering this template with a variable called user that I got over here. So back in this page, I can add a new message. And when I get here, view function did not return a response. You're going to see this a lot. This happens when you don't actually return anything from your view function. What's a view function? These guys right here. And since we're passing, we're not returning anything. So why don't we, just like we did before, return messages new.html. And you might be wondering, how come we need to pass in the user? And the answer is, it's going to be important to get the correct user ID when we create a new message. What does that mean? Well, let's take a look. Back inside of new.html, once again, we're going to extends base.html. We're going to add a block content. We're going to end that block. And we're going to make another form. Or better yet, we'll make a really big h1 that says, add a new message. And this is going to go somewhere. We're going to need an input with a type of text, and that name is going to be content. And then we can add either an input with the type of submit or a button that just says add a new message. Now, where is this going to go? First off, it's going to be a post, but it's going to go to a URL for messages index. And remember, this accepts a keyword argument, user ID. How do we get that? Well, if you remember, we passed in that user right here. So we can say user ID is user.id. And here we can see that content and a button. Let's go take a look at that form now, and we can add a new message. So the form is correct, but when the form is submitted, what do we do? Well, not much. So once again, if request.method is post, well, here we need to add a new message. But how do we do that? Well, we can say, for this specific message, let's make a new instance of a message. And every message has some kind of content, request.form for content. But what did we miss in our messages model? Well, we have no way of actually creating a message. So you might have wondered this whole time, what happened to the dunder init? Well, now we're coming back to it. What this basically means is that to get your migrations to work, you don't need to worry about that dunder init. Dunder init just refers to what's going to be run when rows are created. This is the DDL, the definition of our data. Let's write the DML, what that manipulation is going to look like with each row. So we can finally make our dunder init. Maybe you made this before. We have self, content, and some kind of user ID. And inside of here, we can basically say that self.content is going to be content, and self.userid is going to be that user ID. What this means is when we create a message, there are multiple ways to do this. We're going to be very explicit here. How do we get the right user ID? Well, over here, we have a user ID. This should refer to the correct user that's being created. What do we want to do? db.session.add, new message. Anytime we add and we want to write that to the database, we always have to commit. Then we're going to return a redirect URL for. Where are we going back? We're going back to messages index. What keyword arguments does messages index accept? It accepts a user ID. What value should that be? That could be really anything at this point. It could be new message.userid. It could be this user ID that we get. Any of them work. We just got to make sure we pass that in correctly. So let's save that. Let's go try to add a message, make sure that our server is running, python app.py. And the server will go down sometimes if you mess up a little indentation, so don't worry too much about that. I'm going to add hello world. When I add that new message, the requested URL was not found on the server. Well, you might have figured out what I did here. Users to messages URL for messages index. What's the problem? Looks like I did something with my URL for that isn't great. So pause the video for a second and see if you can figure out what the problem is with my URL for. I'll give you a hint. Take a look at some previous URL fors that I did that accepted some kind of keyword argument. You can maybe find those in new as well. Something I did wrong right here. So you might be wondering what's wrong here, and this code is actually okay, but I forgot to do one thing in my new.html. Remember, we always need Jinja to evaluate this for us. So let's go back to users to messages new, and let's add hello world. We'll add that new message, and there it is. See all the messages for Ellie. This is great. If we want to verify that we've done this correctly on the database level, let's PSQL users messages. And if we take a look at messages, we can see we have a user ID of 2. That looks good. Let's select star from users. We can make sure that user ID 2 refers to this message. A lot of work just to get that up and running. There are a lot of moving parts now. So feel free to take a break, try to implement this on your own. Feel free to follow through on the video. I'm moving quickly, but the goal here is just to try to understand piece by piece what we're doing. All right, let's continue on. What we need to do here now is edit and delete these messages. And this is actually not going to be too bad. I'm going to borrow a lot of code from my new.html and move over to my edit for a message. Instead of messages index, we're going to go to messages show. We need a user ID as well as some kind of message ID when we edit a specific message. So remember, in our app.py, when we render a template, we're going to render messages edit.html. And here we'll make a variable called foundMessage, which is the result of message.query.get just by the ID. Remember, ID refers to the message ID. We don't really need to worry about that user ID too much. So what we can pass in is simply foundMessage, or we'll just call that message, and that's going to be foundMessage. Inside of edit, we can go to a URL for messages show, and the user ID is going to be message.user_ID, and the ID is going to be message.id. You could pass in the user and find it if you want, but all we really need is the ID right here. Let's keep it simple. Finally, we need to make sure we override the method of patch. This is going to be very similar for deleting, so keep this in mind when we delete. One more thing we want to add, make sure we say edit as well as a value of message.content. So we can save this, make sure that we have a way to edit that message. So back in our index for messages, we're going to make an anchor tag over here, make a new line. And here we're going to edit a message. And what is that URL for? That is, once again, URL for messages edit. What keyword arguments do we need? We need a user ID. How do we get that? User.id. You could also do this by message.userid. That's fine. How do we get the ID of the message? That's going to be, once again, message.id. That refers to each message that we're iterating over. So back over here, let's edit a message. That takes us to this form where everything is populated. What do we need to do here? Make sure in our app.py that logic is set up. Same kind of thing as we saw before. If request.method. Once again, got to make sure it's a byte string. If it's patch, what should we do? Well, first thing, let's make sure we get the message. Found message is going to be message.query.get by the ID. And then we'll say found message.content is going to be request.form at content. If that all goes well, db.session.add, found message, db.session.commit. And what do we then want to do? Return, redirect, URL for messages index. Messages index accepts what keyword arguments? Messages index accepts user ID. How do we get the correct user ID? No problem. We're getting it in the URL right here. You could also use found message.user_ID. It's all going to be that same information. So we can save that. We're actually going to add a little bit of logic right now for deleting. So let's go make sure if it's a delete. Instead of db.session.add, we'll db.session.delete. And then we're going to do the same exact thing as before. And right now, I'm not going to build the show page. We don't really need it right now. So we can just render template for messages/show.html if need be. And here we'll pass in some kind of message, which is going to be that found message. I haven't implemented this yet. I'll leave that up to you to do. So let's go refresh this page. Let's go say goodbye world. When I edit this new message, it looks like we're editing correctly. Great. So now we can see all the messages for Ellie. Right over here, you might see that we should probably have some navigation to go back and see the users or delete the user. I'll leave that navigation up to you. We just want to build the CRUD functionality. Right now we can create messages for a user. I'll make another message of, hi everyone. I can edit messages for this specific user, that's me. But what if I want to delete this specific user? Well, I have that working already. What about deleting messages? That I need to add. So inside, I'm going to keep this really simple. I'm going to make a form. Always want this to be a post. Where's this action going to go? It's going to actually be very similar to edit. So I'm going to grab this entire action attribute right here. In fact, let's not do that. Let's type it out so we can really understand what we're doing. I'm going to go to a URL for messages show. But I want to make sure that I override the method for delete. Now, this isn't gonna work yet because I need some keyword arguments. What keyword arguments do I need? Messages show accepts a user ID. Where do I get that? User.id, just like above. How about the ID for the specific message? Just like before, each message has an ID with the method of delete. Inside of this form, I'll just make a button with an X on it. Let's refresh the page, and here we have these X buttons. The CSS could be much better, but we're just trying to delete messages, and it seems like we can do that successfully. Let's add a new message of hello. Let's edit that because I'm being a little aggressive here. I don't even like that message. Let's delete it. That looks great. All right, we're almost done, but there's one last thing. If I add a couple messages like hello, and I'll add a message like goodbye. If I go back to this specific user, let's go back to users right here. If I want to delete this user, I'd also like to delete the messages for that user. So let's see what happens when I delete this user. I'm going to delete Ellie, and let's see what happens. I have two messages that still exist, but that user ID is not there. Well, let's go see what's going on here. So if we take a look at all of the users right here, I've removed all of them. If we take a look at all of the messages right here, I still have 4 and 5. So what's going on here? Well, when I delete a specific user, the user ID is removed from the messages table, but the messages are still there. What I'd really like is that when I delete a user, I want the messages to be deleted as well. So we're going to add one thing to our DB relationship right here, and that's going to be cascade. We're going to say delete or all comma delete. Let's save that, and let's go back and make a new user. We'll add Ellie Showpick back in. Let's go add some messages for Ellie. So let's see the messages, add a new one. Let's say, hi. I'm gonna add that new message, take a look in the table, and we see we have that. Let's go back to users, and let's delete Ellie. And if we take a look at our messages right now, we can see that the message is successfully deleted as well. We call this cascading when we delete. The way to do that is to add cascade all delete to our db.relationship. Remember, this isn't something on the migration level. This is something that SQL Alchemy is going to do for us. We built a lot with this CRUD application, so feel free to take a look through the code. I'll have that on GitHub for you as well. Try to do this on your own, and I'll see you in the next screencast.